The morning heat lingered over Blue Ridge, North Carolina, as William Carter, the newly appointed chief of police, stepped out of his truck. Dressed in faded jeans, a plaid shirt, and worn sneakers, he looked nothing like a man who had spent 30 years in law enforcement. That was intentional. Carter hadn't come to this department to sit behind a desk. He knew Blue Ridge Police Department, BRPD, had a troubled reputation. Whispers of misconduct, prejudice, and unchecked power had tainted its name for years. He had seen it before, departments where bad cops thrived while good officers stayed silent. If there was a toxic culture within his new precinct, he needed to see it with his own eyes, without the polished performances officers put on for leadership. So, instead of making a grand entrance, Carter walked in like an ordinary man, just another face in the crowd. He wanted to observe how his officers treated people they didn't recognize. Would they offer respect? Dismiss him? Or something worse? Carter wasn't looking for perfection. He understood that policing was tough work. But what he wouldn't tolerate was a culture where disrespect and bias thrived unchecked. He came to fix what was broken and restore trust between the department and the people it served. But first, he had to see the truth for himself. And within minutes of stepping inside, he found it. Richard Nelson stepped into the Blue Ridge Police Department, dressed like any ordinary citizen, a worn plaid shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed sneakers. He moved slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the room, taking in the unfiltered reality of the precinct. Officers gathered in small clusters, laughing, exchanging stories, some reviewing paperwork. No one recognized him. That was exactly what he wanted. As he made his way past the break room, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey! You lost?" Richard turned to see a white officer walking toward him with a smirk. The name on his badge read Daniels. Behind him, a few officers leaned against desks, their amused expressions signaling they were eager to see what would unfold. "This isn't a shelter," Daniels said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You need to take that mess somewhere else." Richard remained still, his heartbeat steady. He had spent decades in law enforcement. He had faced hostility before. But this wasn't just rudeness, this was something more. Daniels took a step closer, tilting his head. "Didn't you hear me?" His tone grew harsher. "Get out. We don't need people like you hanging around." A few chuckles rippled through the officers nearby. Richard met Daniels' gaze, unreadable but unwavering. Then, in a sudden act of pure contempt, Daniels spit directly into Richard's face. Time seemed to stop. The laughter grew louder as some officers slapped their desks, entertained by the moment. Not one of them stepped in. Not one of them objected. Richard slowly wiped his face with a handkerchief, his expression unreadable. He took a deep breath, suppressing the instinct to react in anger. Instead, he spoke, his voice firm but steady. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" Daniels smirked, arms crossed. "Only the ones who don't belong." Richard inhaled deeply and turned toward the hallway. From overhead, the precinct's intercom crackled. "All personnel, report to the briefing room immediately." It was time for the truth to come to light. The briefing room buzzed with chatter as officers shuffled in, coffee cups in hand, still riding the high of the morning's casual cruelty. Officer Daniels leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, his smirk still lingering from his earlier encounter. He had no idea what was coming. At the front of the room, Captain Harris cleared his throat. "All right, settle down. We've got an important announcement today." The noise died down as curiosity took over. They were expecting a new police chief, but none of them were prepared for what was about to unfold. Captain Harris nodded toward the side door. Richard Nelson stepped forward. Silence fell like a hammer. Every pair of eyes locked onto him, the same man Daniels had insulted, humiliated, and spat on that very morning. The smirk on Daniels' face vanished. A few officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others stole nervous glances at each other, realization dawning like a slow-moving storm. Richard placed a folder with the precinct's official seal onto the podium, his expression unreadable. Then, in a calm, measured tone, he shattered their illusion. "Good morning. My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I am your new chief of police." A stunned hush filled the room. Daniels went pale, his jaw clenching. Richard scanned the crowd, letting the weight of his words settle. "This morning, I walked into this department as an unknown, just to see how this precinct really operates. What I saw was eye-opening. The officers weren't laughing anymore. The air in the briefing room was thick with tension as Chief Richard Nelson stood at the podium. Just minutes ago, the officers had laughed, mocked, and disrespected the man who now commanded the entire precinct. Their stunned faces showed they understood the weight of their mistake. Richard let the silence linger before speaking, his voice steady but firm. "This morning, I walked into this precinct not as your chief, but as an ordinary citizen. I wanted to see what kind of culture has been allowed to grow here. What I witnessed was disappointing. Some of you treated me like I didn't belong. Others stood by and laughed. And one officer, Officer Daniels, went so far as to spit in my face." Gasps rippled through the room. Daniels' face burned red as eyes darted toward him. But let's be clear, this isn't just about one man's actions. It's about a system, a culture that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. And that ends today." Richard stepped forward, his eyes locking with each officer's. "Respect is not optional. It is the foundation of law enforcement. If we don't respect each other, how can we expect the community to respect us? If we don't hold ourselves to the highest standards, what right do we have to enforce the law on anyone else?" A heavy silence followed. Some officers fidgeted in their seats, while others nodded solemnly, understanding the deeper truth in his words. For too long, this precinct has operated in a way that breeds division and distrust. But that's not what law enforcement is about. We don't serve just the people we like. We don't uphold the law only when it's convenient. This badge represents duty, integrity, and fairness. If those values don't mean something to you, then this is not the place for you." His words hung in the air like a challenge. No one dared to move. Richard took a breath, then delivered the final blow. "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended pending an internal investigation. And let this be clear, this is only the beginning. Change is coming, and I expect every single one of you to rise to the occasion. If you're ready to be better, to serve with honor, then we move forward together. But if you refuse to change, this department has no place for you." With that, Richard stepped back. The room was silent, but the message was clear: things would never be the same again. The silence in the precinct was deafening after Chief Richard Nelson's powerful speech. The officers had expected another routine day, but now, they faced a reality they could no longer ignore. Change had arrived, and it wasn't going to be optional. Richard wasted no time in making that clear. "Effective immediately," he announced, his voice firm and unwavering, "Officer Daniels is suspended pending a full internal investigation." His actions were not just disrespectful, they were a disgrace to the badge he wears. The weight of those words hung in the air. Daniels, once so confident, now sat rigid, his face pale. No one spoke. Some looked uncomfortable, others, ashamed. But Richard wasn't done. I've also ordered a full review of disciplinary records and past complaints within this department. Every officer who has a history of misconduct, excessive force, or racial bias will be investigated. This precinct will no longer be a place where bad cops are protected while good officers are forced to turn a blind eye." A murmur rippled through the room. Some officers shifted uneasily in their seats, while others nodded in quiet agreement. They had seen problems within the department for years, but no one had dared to challenge the system. Until now. "Let me be clear," Richard continued, "this is not about tearing down this department. It's about rebuilding it the right way. I know there are officers in this room who wear this badge with honor, who serve this community with integrity. You deserve to work in a precinct that reflects those values, and the people we serve deserve law enforcement they can trust." He let those words sink in before delivering his final mandate. "From now on, we will have mandatory training on ethics, de-escalation, and bias awareness. Supervisors will be held accountable for the conduct of their teams. There will be zero tolerance for discrimination, corruption, or abuse of power. This precinct is no longer a place where injustice hides in the shadows." The message was clear. This wasn't just talk. This was real reform, real accountability, and a new era for the department. After Chief Richard Nelson's firm address and immediate disciplinary actions, the atmosphere within the precinct shifted. The once light-hearted banter in the hallways turned into hushed whispers. Some officers were visibly shaken, realizing that the complacency they had enjoyed for years had come to an end. Others stood in quiet agreement, relieved that someone had finally stepped up to fix what had long been broken. For some, the changes were overdue. Officer Maria Reyes, a young recruit who had always felt uneasy about the department's culture, approached Chief Nelson after the meeting. "Chief, I want to do better," she admitted. "I've seen things that didn't sit right with me, but I was afraid to speak up." Richard met her gaze. "It starts today, Officer Reyes. You're not alone in this." But not everyone welcomed the reforms. A group of older officers, those who had thrived under the old system, grumbled amongst themselves. "He's making this department soft," one muttered. "We're supposed to police the streets, not babysit them." One officer dared to voice his concerns directly. "Chief, with all due respect, you're shaking things up too fast. Some of us have been doing this for 20 years. You can't just change the way things work overnight." Richard's response was firm but measured. "If the way things worked was so great, we wouldn't have officers abusing their power. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. And it starts now." Tension lingered, but a new sense of accountability had settled in. The precinct was no longer a place where bad cops could hide in plain sight. In the months following Chief Richard Nelson's leadership shakeup, the culture at the Blue Ridge Police Department began to change. Officers who had once dismissed accountability now found themselves under scrutiny. Some resigned, unwilling to adapt to the new standards. Others, like Officer Maria Reyes, embraced the change, understanding that respect and integrity weren't optional but essential. Community members noticed the shift. Complaints against officers dropped, and local residents, who had once viewed the precinct with distrust, began to engage more. Town hall meetings became meaningful conversations rather than tense confrontations. Neighborhood leaders commended the department's efforts, and even longtime skeptics admitted they had seen improvements in how officers interacted with the public. But change didn't come without resistance. Some within the force still clung to the past, believing the new policies weakened their authority. However, as time went on, even they couldn't deny that trust between the police and the community was growing stronger. 1 year after Chief Nelson's appointment, the precinct was in a better place. Recruitment efforts attracted more diverse and ethical candidates, and training programs ensured that every officer understood their duty went beyond enforcing laws. It was about serving with honor. Standing outside the precinct one evening, Richard watched officers leaving their shifts, not with arrogance, but with purpose. Change was never easy, but it was necessary. And in Blue Ridge, it had finally begun. Respect and integrity should never be optional. No matter your position, whether you're a leader, a worker, or a member of your community, how you treat others defines who you are. Chief Richard Nelson's story reminds us that true leadership isn't about power, it's about setting a standard that others can trust and follow. Accountability isn't about punishment, it's about progress. It's easy to look the other way when we see wrongdoing, but turning a blind eye only allows problems to grow. Change begins when we have the courage to confront injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. People can change, but only if they choose to. Some officers in the precinct took Richard's words to heart, realizing they needed to do better. Others resisted, unwilling to let go of old ways. In life, we all face moments where we must decide, do we hold on to outdated beliefs, or do we grow? Trust must be earned. The community in Blue Ridge had lost faith in its police force, and restoring that trust took time, effort, and action. The same is true in our personal lives. If we want respect, we must live in a way that proves we deserve it. In the end, change is possible, but it starts with us.